So I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm executive director of Hyperledger, which is a project hosted at the Linux Foundation. And the Linux Foundation's been around for about 15 years. We've operated at the center initially of just the Linux ecosystem, trying to help steward and provide a home for the Linux kernel developers initially, and then really realizing that the need out there was for governance at two different layers. One layer being the developers, partly to provide a home for Linus Torvalds, so he didn't have to go work for Google, or somebody else, right? But secondly, the thousands of developers who show up to work on the Linux kernel, giving them kind of a governance process so that they know how to channel their different patch sets, their different improvements in, and kind of almost like an air traffic control when those patch sets get to come and land in the kernel, right? And then how do you get that community to work together to create software that enterprises can trust, because they know there's a process to it, they know that the legal picture is all sorted, et cetera. And then the second layer of that is companies, because to actually get this code out there and used and to become the basis of how the world works, you actually do need to work hard, like any software company would, to get it impermeated inside of products and services and help those companies doing that understand how to describe it, right? How to not take too much credit for it, right? How to avoid a Linux being too tightly perceived as being associated with, say, Red Hat or with IBM. You know, when the Linux Foundation started, IBM was taking out Super Bowl ads about their involvement in Linux, and so there was a lot of risk there that people would too tightly associate one company or another with what really has become a really broad-based project. And to give kind of a sense of how alive this project, even just Linux, just talking about that for a second, the kernel project still sees 10,000 new lines of code every day, 7 patch sets or pull requests accepted per hour. And this is for a 26-year-old code base, right? So when technology becomes infrastructural, when it becomes a foundation, something people can take for granted, something becomes a sort of standard, you need this kind of care and feeding and this kind of governance and something that can be global. And so about 5 years ago, the Linux Foundation kind of got its bearings and said, okay, this seems to work. Could we apply this, as people had been asking it, to other related technology domains? Cloud computing, software-defined networking, security software. So you perhaps remember the Heartbleed vulnerability, where people woke up and realized that OpenSSL was being maintained in the spare time of 2 guys named Steve, and that was probably a problem, right? So figuring out how to go around with I don't want to say the tin can, but because it's a lot more than that, but go out and get companies to realize they have a common interest in funding infrastructural software and giving them a role in the evolution of that, and channeling that to stewardship. Hopefully there's enough open source developers who show up to work on your project, but if you need to juice that by hiring some of them or providing a home for them, then do that as well, right? And so all these related technology domains. A few years ago, some folks said, hey, you should figure out something in perhaps the cryptocurrency space, although it seemed clear that there were plenty of foundations spinning up and academic homes and others to focus on one currency or another, and maybe it would make sense to look at the next layer down, which was blockchain technology, which could be used to build a currency system. It could be used to build other types of, as Naya has called them, distributed database platforms. And I'll concede that there are elements of it that are like that. But really to ask, is this a new kind of information system, and are there new ways to apply that, right? And so the Hyperledger project was launched December 2015. I joined in May of 2016, and it's gone into some interesting places. But that's not what I wanted to talk about, because that's kind of boring. The two things that I wanted to kind of get out, there's 2 ideas that I wanted to get out. The first is that in technology movements, it's really useful to be able to talk about 3 different kinds of activities. And in my mind, it makes sense to kind of think of consortia and collections of developers and technical types and organizations that look at these 3 different domains. And these 3 are standards, governance, and implementation, right? So to talk about this in technology that's been around for 25 years, let's talk about the domain name system. In the domain name system, which is still an evolving thing, there are still new ways in which the DNS is changing, new standards, new services, security layers being added, that sort of thing. You've had this separation of interest between the standards bodies, which really there's only been the Internet Engineering Task Force. Perhaps other bodies have been involved, but that's the one that has largely been seen as the home for defining the DNS systems. You've had implementers, people who build DNS software, who range from individuals like Paul Vixie and the Internet Software Consortium that he set up, who were the authors of Bind, really the first real DNS software, open source, got promulgated everywhere, helped standardize, helped get everybody on the same page in terms of how to use DNS software. And then you had initially John Postal and the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority and other groups that eventually became ICANN. And ICANN has received a lot of controversy. It's been had a series of leaders who've tried to really establish an independent home for it. But ICANN is the reason why when you look up MIT.edu, you get the same DNS response, I think, more or less in every country, or as close as you can for any type of domain name you'd want to look up. And that's incredibly hard to do. It's a really delicate balance. If all three of these activities had been done by one organization or even by one open source community, right, it would have been really hard to tease apart the debates that are necessarily about architecture from the debates that are necessarily about and the way systems should talk to each other from an architectural point of view, to bugs in the code, right? And distinguishing when something is a bug or a feature, and getting competition going as well there, because I think competition in implementations is still good. To the third thing being questions about, well, there's different cultures, different societies who believe in different rationales for how domain names should be managed. How should you resolve a trademark dispute, for example? How should you resolve it when somebody appears to have stolen somebody else's domain name, right? How do you transfer domain names from one party to another, right? If you had tried to mix all those into one project, that would have been really complicated and awkward and weird, right? And so when I think about other technology standards like HTTP, the web standard, that also followed a very similar pattern. You had, again, the Internet Engineering Task Force developing the HTTP standards. You had implementers like Apache or Microsoft or Netscape, if anyone remembers them, building HTTP servers. And then for the security certificates and other things for the web, you had governance organizations like the CA Forum, which managed who out there are all the security or certificate authorities, that sort of thing. And so when we think about blockchain technologies, I do want you to think about what are the kinds of organizations that might sit in this kind of three-way kind of map. I've kind of firmly planted, and I think we've at Hyperledger firmly planted our flag in the implementation side. There are plenty of other, not a huge number now, but potentially plenty of other standards bodies for blockchain technology. The Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, for example, seems to be heading very much in that direction. ISO and even the IETF are starting to talk about blockchain-related standards. And it's, you could even look at things like the Lightning Network standards as, a kind of a quasi-standards kind of setting organization there. Governance is another thing that we think necessarily needs to happen elsewhere. Because in blockchain technology, we think in a world where you have a lot of these different ledgers, you have a few public ones, and you have a whole lot of private ones for different use cases, for different fields or geographies. Each one of those is going to have a different governance model, right? Each one of them is going to have some binding legal agreement between them about how to manage personal data, about other types of things that go beyond what smart contracts can do in terms of binding the responsibilities the parties have to each other. together. And that's well beyond our pay grade. It's really useful to be able to tease these apart and say, just as you could use Linux for any kind of application, for any kind of use case, and there's nothing about Linux that forces you to adopt certain political views, certain points of view on how legal contracts between parties should work, all of that sort of thing. That separation of concerns is really important, right? So this kind of three-way model, and to really let's think about in the long term, what does it mean for blockchain governance organizations to be as efficient as possible, as lightweight as possible? I've sometimes described ICANN, for example, as a minimally viably centralized kind of organization, and that's controversial. They do sit at the top of the DNS infrastructure and kind of manage the relationships with all the registrars and require them to follow certain technical standards and certain legal standards as well. But they've been remarkably effective at what they do, and we have an internet that works today partly because of them. And if we could find ways to replicate that elsewhere, it might be worthwhile. The second point I'd like to make is how you build technology might be more important than what you build. I think the success of open source software comes not simply because the software is free, right? And here I'm singing a song that perhaps many of us have been singing for 25 years about the importance of free software and the importance of open source software. But in a world where, especially with Git, everything is a fork, where there's a lot of people building their own things and easily launching a GitHub here, throwing it out, and then focusing more on writing code and less on building community. It's easy to forget that a lot of the power of open source software comes from collaboration, comes from ideas being mooted early and being vetted and being taken down a notch or being promoted before code is even written. Right? It comes a lot from projects where the leadership of that technology isn't a set of people who all work at the same company or all work in the same geographic region or in the same field, but from this kind of diversity of views that tend to drive the technology towards more generic and potentially more applicable domains. And so when my position on this comes not just from being at the Linux Foundation for just 2 years now, but comes from having been involved in projects like Apache, where the Apache Software Foundation has a couple hundred different projects under its wing, and the leadership there doesn't care at all, really, what you're building. What they care is that each project is led by a multi-stakeholder set of developers who realize that their charter is not just writing code and shipping it and getting people to use it and trust it, but to constantly mentor new developers up this contribution curve from being users to people who report bugs, to people who submit a patch, to becoming more actively involved, to maybe becoming a core contributor, a core maintainer, as some projects call them. And so as we evaluate out there technologies in the blockchain space, open source is table stakes, right? Right now, I mean, every smart contract, there's a couple of confidential approaches to smart contracts, but pretty much every smart contract depends upon being open source and widely shared. There's a couple of proprietary blockchain platforms, but they really don't matter. Most of them, all of the major ones are open source. But if you're looking at these technologies and deciding what to build upon, you really should try to turn the dial towards the ones that at least have the goal, the aim of trying to be multi-stakeholder projects, right? Trying to move beyond not just a particular company, but beyond a particular token, because this is something that is new for us in open source. We understand multi-stakeholdership from a, let's not let this project be dominated by one vendor point of view, but understanding how do we get the most out of competing communities out there of developers who now have major financial stakes in the outcome of one coin or one currency system over another, right? The more that we can do to try to drive collaboration across them, the less wasted effort we're going to have. And right now it might seem like gravity doesn't apply because there's so much money that is flooded into the system that we can afford to write something as complicated as Ethereum 10 times over. But really we're going to benefit and get further faster and get to solid foundations if there's greater collaboration between the developers working on these different systems. And ultimately, at the end of the day, allowing us to spend less time on the plumbing and more time on truly interesting and differentiating applications on top. So with that, that's really all I want to say. Thank you.